one of the things that you hit on that is like my big fear with all the protests, the uprisings that we're seeing across the country, and the toppling of Confederate monuments, the painting Black Lives Matter on city streets. My fear is that this movement that we're in the middle of could possibly get co-opted. What is your take on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I'm of two minds about it, right? There's the reality that some of it has already been co-opted, and it was so easily co-opted because it wasn't necessarily incompatible with corporate ways of thinking and talking about diversity, right? There's certain ways of thinking about the market and how everyone should have access to it. That wasn't incompatible with what I think the most mainstream notion of Black Lives Matter is, which is it's a demand for equal protection before the law, right? It's a demand for full recognition of African Americans as citizens, within the context of liberal democracy, right? And that's not incompatible if you work at Microsoft or Google, right? Even if they're not going to engage in aggressive hiring, right? That as far as marketing, public relations, that's something that they can assimilate, right? And so I think there's that part of it, right? Where, as I mentioned in one of the pieces that came out, last month, there's ideological convergence, maybe more so than cooptation, which happened, right? Where you've got particular expressions of Black Lives Matter, which again fit nicely within the context of the corporate world, right? So another good example of this, right? I mean, I love Kaepernick, and I supported Kaepernick in his stance. But what happens after Kaepernick gets booted from the NFL, right? He's picked up by Nike, and I'm glad it gave him a way to survive. But what does that say, right? It's like Nike didn't have a problem with his stance on an extreme problem, right? The problem of police killing of Black civilians, right? So it's kind of like that's something that we can all oppose and should all oppose. But there are other political stances that Black people are taking and have been taking over the last few months, which aren't co-opted or embraced by the corporate world in the same ways, right? So, many Black people who are in the so-called essential workers category, right? People who continue to work in the food service industry, who are in the production of livestock and other food supplies, people who are in the delivery, right, and shipping dimensions, gig economy folks who are working for Instacart and all these other companies. A lot of them said, we're not being protected in the midst of this pandemic. We don't have basic safety equipment. We don't have, we're not being paid adequately. We should get more money for this. And so some of them began organizing strikes and walkouts and circulating petitions. Those organizers got fired, right? So you can see in that case, we're still talking about Black people in many cases, but their demands don't square with what the central logics of capital actually are, right? Which is those demands are they actually cut into the kind of profit making that these corporations exist for, right? So I think that's where we can see how do you stop something from being co-opted, right? You make demands which don't necessarily square as easily with the central logics of capital. That would be my sense of it. But I mean, a lot of people, when I wrote that piece, there were people who rejected it on the grounds that, well, this is always going to happen, and that there's something else that's going on here that's more substantial on the ground, and it hasn't been co-opted, right? And so, there's been a few friends of mine that made that argument to me. I've seen a few other people respond on social media with the same kind of sentiment. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's true up to a point, right? There are things that are happening on the ground which have nothing to do with the corporate right? There's campaigns locally where people are pushing for real reforms, right? So I'm not denying that, but I just think that it does matter though, right? Because the money is gonna shape some behaviors, and it's gonna shape certain organizations going forward, whether we like to think about that or not, right? I mean, it is going to set the agenda as far as what Black Lives Matter might mean, or anti-racism is going to mean in concrete terms, both within the corporate world, but also within, civil rights organizations, anti-policing organizations, and campaigns locally. But I think that's a real fear about being co-opted. I just think that some things that are more difficult to be co-opted, and we have to keep reminding ourselves of why, and keep pushing for those things, right? Things that the front office and the corporate world really does not want. Those should be our demands.
To hear the rest of this show and more, you can find us at This Is Revolution Podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, Podbean, and wherever else you get your podcasts. This is Revolution. Oh, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button.